All right, now just following the G20 summit will be the COP26 summit that will be held in Glasgow, and climate change is all the rage now. T-shirts with climate change, songs about climate change, it's everywhere. But how nuanced is this conversation? Do we even understand what real climate action means? Now take governments, for example. They have a new pet project. It's called net zero emissions. Now what does this mean? What you produce must be equal to what you remove from the atmosphere. You're talking about greenhouse gases here. If you produce about, let's say, 10 tons of carbon dioxide, you must also remove about 10 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That is what it means when we say net zero emissions. Now, how can you achieve this? There are many ways of doing this. You can grow more forests. You can cut down on your emissions. You can use green technologies, and all of these strategies could lead to net zero emissions. The Western world loves it. It gives the impression that they're actually doing something. The United States, Britain, Australia and the European Union have the same deadline, net zero by 2050. And what is interesting is that they want other nations to also do the same, that is, reach net zero by about the year 2050 or maybe 2060. But India, of course, is not playing ball with the Western nations on this. Now, here's what the Environment Secretary has had to say. It is how much carbon you're going to be putting into the atmosphere before reaching net zero. That is what is more important. Now, he's right. Net zero targets are becoming a bit of an excuse. As one scientist has put it, burn now, pay later. This is what the West is doing. They're still emitting greenhouse gases. They are still cutting down forests. And if you question them, then they talk about their net zero targets. But the fact is, climate change is already here. It's not going to wait for another 30 years. Plus, carbon removal doesn't happen in real time. So let's show you as to what folks at the Greenpeace, in fact, have to say. Net zero pledges are being released now practically on a daily basis. They assume that emissions from burning coal can be compensated in real time by protecting a forest or by planting trees, ignoring the fact that plants need time to grow, while cutting fossil fuel emissions has immediate results. So do you see the problem in this? The West hasn't got a long-term solution. They're trying to bank on money and they're trying to bank on technology and not on cutting down emissions. But to remove the greenhouse gases they produce, it is a good plan but far from perfect. Our goal must be to cut all emissions, not to plant a tree for every piece of coal that we burn. Now, that's a license to keep using fossil fuels. So what is India proposing? Now, more focus on the process. India wants to reduce emission intensity of its economy. By 2016, a 24% dip was reported. The final target is about 35% in terms of cutting down on emissions, and India wants to achieve this by the year 2030. Now, to make this happen, you need climate financing. We're talking about a lot of money here. India needs to spend a jaw-dropping $2.5 trillion to meet the targets. The question, of course, is where will all of this money come from? The Western nations can, of course, afford to splurge on climate change. Countries like India cannot. Their primary commitment still remains the emancipation and economic prosperity of people. So what's the middle ground here? We already have one. It was agreed upon at the Rio summit back in 1992. Common but differentiated responsibility. You see, emissions do not disappear on their own. Carbon dioxide can stay on in the atmosphere for centuries, which means that the pollution you see today is probably a few centuries old, and it could be the result of what the European economies had done many decades ago. It is called historical emissions. And here's how each country stacks up on historical emissions. The United States, 28.8%, China, 9%, Russia, about 8%, Germany, about 7%, Britain, about 5.8%, and India, just 2.4% of the historical emissions. North America and Europe began their industrial revolutions in the 18th century. What about India? We started our industrial age in the 20th century. The Western world had a bit of a head start of nearly about 150 years. That is 150 more years of pollution. But the finish line apparently is the same for everyone, 2050 or 2060. So how is this even fair? Western nations became rich by polluting the world, and now they are preventing nations like India from doing the same. We understand that climate change is a global problem, but we must also identify the perpetrators, the real perpetrators, and the victims of climate change. At COP26, the West must, of course, loosen its purse strings. Climate action must be funded by the climate criminals of the West. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.